He thought her silence meant surrender, but silence is not mercy. Silence is a blade disguised as peace. At first, it seemed gentle, like the pause before a storm, like breath caught between forgiveness and finality. He mistook it for weakness because it didn't scream. He forgot that the quietest forces in nature are often the most lethal. The tide recedes before it swallows the shore. The air stills before lightning divides the sky, and a woman withdraws before the soul of a man begins to disintegrate. For months he was the center. His voice carved the space between them, his certainty ruled it. He loved her most when she doubted herself, when her eyes sought his approval. That gaze, that trembling need to be seen, was his invisible throne. He fed on her validation the way the sun feeds on prayer. He believed her devotion meant safety. He didn't know it was the slow prelude to his undoing. Because when she began to fall silent, something ancient shifted. The current reversed. What once chased began to watch. What once justified began to disappear. He stood before the same woman but could not recognize her. She no longer reached for him. She no longer explained. She no longer argued to be understood. And in that absence, his mind began to split open. The ego, when denied reflection, turns against itself. Jung knew this, that what we refuse to face within, we demand from another. She was his mirror once. The anima projected outward, clothed in her softness, her empathy, her willingness to absorb his chaos. He did not love her as a person, but as the living vessel of his unclaimed soul. When she withdrew, he felt it like death, because it was the death of his illusion, the end of his control, the annihilation of the false self that only existed through her eyes. He begins to chase her shadow, not the woman. He replays her words at night, dissecting tone, breath, timing, searching for the smallest thread of guilt he could pull to reel her back in. The obsession grows because obsession is the last refuge of the powerless. When he can no longer dominate her presence, he seeks to possess her absence. He follows her silence as if it were a trail of blood through the dark. But silence is not emptiness. It is containment. It is power condensed. The feminine, when withdrawn, does not vanish. She descends inward into the underworld of her own becoming. There, in the depth of solitude, she faces what he never could, the wound beneath attachment, the shadow beneath desire. She does not escape pain. She becomes its alchemist. Her detachment is not cruelty. It is transmutation. He cannot see this. He is ruled by the ancient fear of the devouring mother, the witch who holds him accountable for his unintegrated self. Her silence terrifies him because it unmasks his dependency. He calls her cold, detached, heartless, but those are the names men give to women who no longer serve as mirrors. Her stillness burns him because it reveals the truth. He was never in love with her. He was in love with his reflection in her care. And you who listen, know this pattern too well. The endless explaining, the small deaths of self to maintain peace, the anxiety of being misunderstood by someone who only loves their own echo. You think silence will make you lose them, but silence is what finally shows them they never had you. When she withdraws, the masculine without discipline collapses. His world was built on the illusion of control. Without her emotional gravity to orbit, he drifts into the void of his own unacknowledged trauma. The boy abandoned long ago begins to scream through the man's obsession. The rage, the confusion, the pleading, all masks for the same wound, the terror of being unseen without her gaze. Yet the true cruelty is cosmic, not personal, for it is not she who punishes him, but his own shadow. Silence does not wound him, it simply reveals the wound that was always there. He mistook her love for healing, her patience for salvation. But she was never meant to fix him. She was meant to awaken him, and awakening is never gentle. Tonight, understand this. Silence is not withdrawal, it is initiation. The feminine withdraws not to punish, but to reclaim the energy she once gave freely. When she stops explaining, she is not losing faith. She is remembering who she is beyond the mirror of his need. So when you feel the urge to speak, to justify, to fill the space with apology, don't. Let the void do what it was designed to do. Let it show him his reflection in the absence of your light. Because silence, when held in truth, is not passive. It is the storm contained in stillness. It is the eye that sees without trembling. And he will feel it, not as rejection, but as the unbearable presence of what he lost. Your availability, your energy, your gaze. Every empire he built upon your compliance will begin to crumble. And in that ruin, something holy begins for both. He begins to decay in his WN echo. The room that once felt charged with her attention now hums with absence. The silence he mocked becomes a mirror too sharp to touch. Every sound, the hum of the refrigerator, the closing of a door, the dull throb of his own heartbeat, reminds him that she is no longer listening. And that, for him, is unbearable. Men like him are not destroyed by rejection. They are destroyed by the loss of the stage upon which their ego performs. Her silence dismantles that theater light by light. He calls it ghosting, cruelty, emotional detachment. But it is none of these things. It is spiritual surgery, the cutting away of false intimacy, of illusions sustained through her endless forgiveness. In the beginning, she thought explaining would save them. She gave language to every wound, named every fracture, bled through words so he could see. But words became her prison. He learned their rhythm, used them as weapons, twisted them until she began to doubt her own meaning. That is how control hides, beneath understanding. Every apology became another chain. Now she has no need to be understood. The moment she stops performing empathy, the dynamic collapses. The archetypal balance reverses. She, once the pursued, becomes the axis. He, once the sun, becomes the shadow circling her silence. Jung called it enantiodromia, the inevitable reversal of energies when something reaches its extreme. His dominance has turned inward, consuming him. Her withdrawal is the alchemical fire that exposes what he refused to see. He senses it as madness, that haunting awareness that he no longer occupies her thoughts. He texts, he calls, he imagines accidents, betrayal, another man. But these are only projections, the psyche's desperate attempt to avoid facing its own abyss. For what he truly fears is not her silence, but his own. When the anima retracts, the masculine ego is left naked before itself. Every defense collapses. The control, the logic, the confidence all dissolve into primitive terror. The boy who once sought his mother's gaze awakens within him, screaming for reassurance. But she does not return. She cannot. Her silence is not punishment. It is initiation into wholeness. And for her, the descent is equally brutal. Withdrawal is not peace. It is rebirth through fire. The energy that once poured outward must now descend inward, through grief, through guilt, through the ancient reflex to nurture even what harms her. She faces the part of her that equated love with self-abandonment, the part that mistook care for control, the part that wanted to be chosen so badly she forgot she already was by her own soul. In that underworld, she meets her shadow, the witch, the siren, the mother denied. Each archetype whispers what she suppressed: rage, hunger, knowing. She learns that compassion without boundaries becomes servitude, and that silence without self-possession is merely repression. The difference now is sacred. Her silence no longer hides fear. It emanates authority. He senses this change long before he can name it. The same energy that once begged for his love now feels untouchable. He cannot provoke her, cannot charm her, cannot guilt her into reaction. The silence that once seemed like distance now feels like divinity. And this is where obsession mutates into reverence, the paradox of the unintegrated masculine before the self-possessed feminine. But do not mistake his longing for awakening. Many men confuse pursuit with transformation. What he wants is not her soul, it is the sensation of being alive through her rejection. He feeds on the pain of absence because it keeps her ghost near. Yet the true transformation begins only when he faces himself without the illusion of her forgiveness. And you, listening, know this cycle well. You have lived inside that loop of proving, pleasing, explaining. You have mistaken reaction for connection. You have confused being needed with being loved. But silence is the threshold, the bridge between who you were and who you must become. The world will call you cold for walking away without explanation. They will name your detachment cruelty. But silence is not cruelty when it protects the sacred. You are not withholding, you are remembering. You are not punishing, you are reorienting your power. Tonight, let your absence speak in a language he cannot manipulate. Let it echo through the hollow places where his ego once reigned. You owe him no closure. Closure belongs to those who still seek control. You are not there to soften his descent. Every man must meet his own shadow alone. Because silence, when born of consciousness, does not end the story. It exposes its truth. It reveals the architecture of dependency and forces the soul to stand on its own legs. She has become the mirror no longer tilted toward him. And in that still reflection, his illusions dissolve one by one. The woman who once pleaded to be seen has become the one who sees without needing to be. Seen in return. He will return, of course. They always do. Drawn not by love, but by the unbearable gravity of the silence that shows them who they truly are. He dreams of her now not as she was, but as she became. In those dreams, she does not speak. She only watches. Her eyes hold the quiet of something that no longer belongs to him, and that is what destroys him most. For the first time, he understands that her silence was not a wall, it was a mirror that refused to reflect his illusion. He wakes with her name in his mouth like dust. The texts go unsent, the calls unanswered. The space between them grows sacred, unbearable, infinite. He begins to walk through his days haunted not by her absence, but by his own unintegrated self. Jung said that whatever we do not make conscious will return as fate, and now fate has taken her voice from him, the one he used to drown out the sound of his own emptiness. The masculine, when unhealed, worships control. He measures love by obedience, loyalty by self-erasure. But control is the language of fear, not devotion. And fear, when faced with silence, consumes itself. His obsession has become ritual, checking her last scene, imagining her laughter in another room, replaying old arguments like prayers to a dead god. Yet beneath every obsession lies grief. Beneath every fixation lies the terror of losing the mirror that once confirmed existence. He was never addicted to her love. He was addicted to the version of himself that her love made him feel like. Her gaze was his sanctuary, and now that temple has fallen silent. What remains is the ruin of self-deception, the raw stone of what he truly is when no one is watching. And she does not gloat. She does not even think of revenge. Her silence is not an act of superiority. It is a reclamation of sacred energy. She understands now that the opposite of love is not hate, it is unconscious attachment. What she once called connection was often a wound disguised as intimacy. His need for control mirrored her fear of abandonment. His ego sought worship, her trauma sought salvation. Together they reenacted an ancient ritual, the dance of the unhealed anima and the exiled animus. Every relationship becomes an initiation when seen through the lens of the soul. Love, when unconscious, repeats the wound. When conscious, reveals it. She begins to see that every time she chased him, she was running from her own silence. Every time she explained, she was seeking permission to exist. And every time she forgave, She was trying to resurrect a man who did not want to awaken. But there is a point in every woman's descent when the pain no longer seeks return, it seeks meaning. That is where she now stands, on the threshold between grief and sovereignty. The silence that began as defense becomes devotion not to him, but to her own wholeness. She realizes that what she thought was love was often fear in disguise, the fear of being alone, unseen, unchosen. Yet in solitude, she discovers something larger than choice, presence. Presence has no need to prove. It does not chase, it does not convince. It simply exists, radiant and immovable. And from that stillness, the feminine regains her power, not the power to dominate, but to remain untouched by illusion. He senses this even from afar. The psychic bond they once shared begins to transform. What was once emotional gravity now feels like energetic resistance. He tries to reach her through nostalgia, guilt, charm, the old tactics that once pulled her back. But none of them work, because they no longer land on the same frequency. Her silence has changed tone from reactive to sovereign. It no longer hides hurt, it declares arrival. For the unawakened man, this is unbearable. He cannot comprehend that she does not hate him, does not love him, does not even need to forgive. He was the storm. She has become the sky, and storms, no matter how loud, cannot harm the sky that contains them. To the one listening now, understand this. Silence is not the end of love, but its purification. It strips away illusion until only essence remains. If he cannot meet you there, it is not your loss, it is his refusal to rise. Do not break your silence to soothe the ego that once fed on your softness. Do not return to explain the lesson his soul must earn through solitude. If you speak, let it be through presence, through boundaries, through unshakable calm. The words he once demanded now carry no power, because power has shifted from speech to stillness. In this stillness, something ancient awakens. The queen, not as ruler of others, but as sovereign of her own inner kingdom. She understands now that love is not given through surrender, but through alignment. Her worth was never his to recognize. It was only ever hers to remember. And he, left with his reflection, must now face what she already has, the self behind the projection. Only then can he begin his own descent, his own confer. Ontation with shadow, his own rebirth into wholeness. Until then, her silence remains, not as a punishment, but as a mirror. The mirror he once feared, now turned inward. The unraveling has become prophecy. What began as heartbreak now feels like initiation. His body moves, but his spirit lingers in the echo of her absence, that vast, formless silence that no distraction can fill. He tries to resurrect himself through noise, conversation, screens, other bodies, but nothing touches the depth she once mirrored. Because what he craves was never her, it was the part of him that only awakened in her presence. And now that she is gone, that part calls to him from the underworld of his psyche. Obsession becomes descent. It strips him layer by layer. The confident man fractures into the boy into the wound into the void. Here he meets what she already faced, the truth that love without self-awareness is only repetition. Every desperate thought becomes a thread leading him back to his origin. The moment he learned that affection must be earned, that love comes at the price of submission or control. He sees it now. She was never the first to withdraw. She was only the one who reflected the mother's first silence. And this is where most men flee. For to see the mother archetype in one's desire is to confront the roots of dependency. The anima becomes not a lover, but a mirror of the feminine within, the intuitive, emotional, chaotic energy the masculine has exiled from itself. To face it is to shatter the illusion of control. Yet if he endures, if he does not run from the silence but listens to it, it begins to speak. And what it whispers is liberation. She did not destroy you. She only stopped carrying your shadow. Meanwhile, her silence deepens not outward but inward. It is no longer a performance but a frequency. People feel it when she enters a room, the quiet authority of one who has faced her own darkness and did not flinch. This is not detachment born of trauma, but detachment born of transcendence. She no longer needs to convince, seduce, or explain. Her energy has become self-referential, like the moon that shines not by effort, but by reflection of an unseen sun. This new power is misunderstood. The world romanticizes brokenness and calls healing arrogance. Men who once desired her warmth now find themselves disarmed by her composure. They call her intimidating, emotionless, hard to love. But she is not hard to love, she is hard to manipulate. And that difference terrifies the unintegrated masculine, whose power once relied on her compliance. In silence, she has remembered her divinity. The witch awakens not as destroyer but as revealer. Her energy exposes falseness with a single glance. Words become unnecessary. The world begins to rearrange itself around her frequency. Opportunities, relationships, paths, all respond to the vibration of sovereignty she now holds. The silence that once felt heavy now hums with creation. Yet even sovereignty carries temptation. Power can seduce just as pain once did. She must remain vigilant not to use her silence as armor. Detachment is not numbness. It is awareness without reaction. To remain in that space, to feel everything and still choose nothingness, that is mastery. That is the sacred balance between the feminine's chaos and the masculine's order within her. And you, listening now, stand at this same threshold. The part of you that still wants to be understood is the part that has not yet forgiven yourself for ever begging to be seen. You do not need to convince anyone of your worth. You need only witness your own becoming. Every time you choose silence over explanation, you are practicing trust in your inner authority. He feels it too, not consciously but somatically. The pull to become the man who can meet her silence without fear. The archetype of the king begins to stir faintly. The king does not demand devotion, he evokes respect. He does not need to dominate, he embodies direction. The boy seeks reassurance, the man offers presence. If he ever returns, it will not be to possess her, but to stand beside her in equal stillness. But until then, his suffering continues not as punishment, but as purification. For obsession, when endured without escape, becomes the crucible of awakening. Every sleepless night, every unanswered message, every replayed memory burns away another layer of ego. In time, even his longing will become prayer, not for her return, but for his integration. Silence then becomes the teacher both feared and needed. It holds the power to destroy and to resurrect. Through it, she becomes whole. Through it, he learns humility. And through their separation, a deeper union is born, not between them, but within each. There is a night when the noise finally collapses. No more bargaining with the past, no more reaching through screens for ghosts. He sits alone, no music, no words, no escape. J. Us breath, heartbeat, and the hollow ache of what once was. And in that ache, something ancient begins to breathe again. The silence he feared now becomes presence. The emptiness he cursed becomes space. It is here the masculine finally meets the divine within himself. Not in conquest, not in control, but in surrender. The death of the ego feels like drowning, yet it is only the weight of illusions being pulled from his lungs. The image of her still hovers not as fantasy, but as symbol. She was never his possession, she was his reflection. Through her silence, he has come face to face with the unclaimed feminine within, the softness, the empathy, the vulnerability he once exiled. And as he sits in that awareness, grief transforms into reverence. He begins to understand the architecture of his obsession. Every attempt to dominate her was a cry for safety. Every accusation of her withdrawal was a projection of his own absence. The silence he called punishment was the mirror of his own spiritual amnesia. Now, stripped of distraction, he begins the work she had already done, the descent into shadow, the reconciliation of opposites. He learns what she already knew, that love without consciousness is only attachment in disguise. And she moves through her world differently now. There is a clarity to her stillness. The air around her hums with restraint, precision, and calm. She has learned to exist without performance, to speak without seeking validation. Her boundaries are no longer defenses but expressions of truth. She gives without depletion, receives without guilt. Her energy is clean. People sense it instinctively, the balance between grace and distance. The men who once mistook her silence for a challenge now feel it as command. The women who feared rejection in their own hearts begin to awaken through her example. This is how transformation ripples, one consciousness reclaiming itself, quietly altering the archetypal field around it. The feminine in her no longer bends to soothe the wounded masculine in others. She honors it but does not heal it. She has learned that nurturing without discernment becomes self-erasure. Her empathy is now guided by boundaries, her compassion laced with clarity. The queen archetype has fully emerged not as ruler by dominance but as presence through equilibrium. Her silence no longer says, "Stay away." It says, "Stand correctly." This is the polarity reborn, not the toxic dance of control and submission, but the sacred geometry of two integrated forces meeting in stillness. The feminine holds the void, receptive, magnetic, infinite. The masculine offers structure, grounded, directed, unwavering. Together they create balance, but only after each has met their own shadow and solitude. Without that descent, love remains only projection. And you, listening in this quiet hour, feel the same truth stirring. The ache that once felt personal now reveals itself as mythic, the universal story of anima and animus seeking reunion through separation. When you withhold your words, you are not rejecting love. You are teaching the world how to meet you in consciousness. Silence is your sacred boundary, the space through which only truth can enter. Do not break it to soothe another's discomfort. Do not explain it to those who feed on chaos. Let them call you cold. Let them call you unreachable. The sun, too, seems distant to the shadow that cannot comprehend its heat. The woman who learns to hold silence becomes untouchable, not because she closes her heart, but because she opens it only to what can hold its magnitude. She no longer negotiates her intuition. She no longer apologizes for her absence. She no longer fears being misunderstood. To be misunderstood is the price of sovereignty. He will understand eventually. Perhaps not now, perhaps never in words. But on some level of soul, he will feel it, that her withdrawal was the beginning of his awakening, that her silence was the sound of his shadow being called home. And when that realization comes, years later, maybe lifetimes, he will know that love was never lost. It simply changed shape, became consciousness, became freedom. The silence between them will remain vast, luminous, alive. No longer the battlefield of projection, but the temple of integration. She has become whole. He has begun to awaken, and the archetype that once devoured them both now bows before what they've become. Power does not scream, it does not chase, it does not explain. The woman who knows her worth does not argue, she vanishes. And the world grows quiet.